Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
This wonderful morning, we have April De Simone on with us this morning. Good morning, April.
Good morning, Mr. Oakes. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I'm in D.C. It's a cloudy day here today. The weather is beautiful, though. Where are you? What part of the world are you in today?
I'm oscillating between Montgomery and Tuskegee, Alabama, learning some incredible history from people who are on the front lines of the SNCC movement and beyond. So it's been really great to chime in from here.
Okay.
Inspirational.
So you're in Alabama. Where's home for you?
New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey.
Okay. Jersey girl. All right.
So New York, Bronx, New York, born and raised. Pricing of living in New York has me in Trenton, New Jersey now.
So is AOC your representative in the House?
In the Bronx, yes. If I was to live in the Bronx, it would be AOC. Okay. Absolutely.
I think she's phenomenal, but yeah. Tell me.
Green New Deal.
You've started a group called Practice of Democracy. What is that?
Practice of Democracy is a research and design firm focused on how we spatialize a practice of these values of equity, justice, and healing through the ways we plan, design, and build the environments and systems we experience day to day on the street.
Equity, justice, and healing. Practice of democracy. So when I think of democracy, I think that we as individuals, members of a community, go out and vote for individuals, and we vote for policies, or let's just say policies, and we try to vote for people that will create the policies that we want. So when I think of practice of democracy, it would be the practice of voting for people, and those people then voting on creating policies and being on policies that would help us with equity, justice, and healing. Is that what you mean by practice of democracy?
It certainly is a part of the answer. It's a yes and component. It's not just that it's invoking that there's a plurality of democracy. Doing the work, whether it was the Undesigned the Red Line exhibition that has traveled internationally throughout this country, has really brought the boots on the ground connectivity. When you speak to people and you talk about democracy or this practice, what usually comes up in that conversation is how equity shows up in their housing, their education, their healthcare. So our work is really looking at how we've gotten to a place where there is this disconnect or incredible disparities within these spaces, and how do we resurrect this hope through the ground practice of democracy. Policy is one area, but how do we activate things like cooperatives or shared value models within the built environment that really bring people closer to these concepts of equity, justice, and healing that are rooted at the foundation of a belief of democracy. So it's this practice on the block level of these value systems and these concepts.
It sounds like you've taken on a lot. That's a big push. This practice of democracy in voting, policies, practices, cooperatives, and shared values. You keep using the word equity, and I want to come back to that word: equity, justice, and healing, healthcare, education, child care, housing. All of these different things, when you look at our communities, are blighted or not there, and you're looking at what is the practice of the democracy that causes those things to be the way they are when you walk through the Bronx or any of our neighborhoods. Do I have it right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. It's when you walk down the street, it tells you a story of the consciousness of our stewardship of democracy. So when you have someone living in blighted or humanly uninhabitable housing, for example, to me and to a growing number of us who do not normalize that condition, it is an indictment to our belief in democracy. Because in a democratic society for many of us, and it's not just democracy itself, it's a value that takes practice. And if that's how you feel it's okay to have these conditions exist, with all that we've been indoctrinated with this concept of we the people, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to me it's unacceptable. And as a civic steward, what is my role in invoking a consciousness within the space of architecture, planning, and design to say, how do we develop neighborhoods that, one, are truly desegregated, two, housing does not look like this, three, heals these legacies of dehumanization that we come from. And that takes intentional practice. It's not something that's on our consciousness to do. We think it's just voting. It isn't. We have a responsibility to steward these values every single day in how we practice in our work and beyond.
So why are you mentioning architecture? Is that your field of study?
I'm 12 credits shy of my master's in architecture, and I do have my master's in design and urban ecologies from Parson. So it's, for me, understanding that's the professional pedigree, but the personal pedigree. Growing up in the Bronx, where 85 to 90% of my neighborhood was rubble, growing up in a home that was burned by those fires in 3 rooms with a kerosene heater and no running hot water, tells you very, very early on the tale of 2 Americas or 2 democracies. And watching people work and sacrifice and realizing this has to change. So it really steered me into a space, how do we apply belonging and beauty in spaces that people have long forgotten or don't think are deserving of those values or those experiences. So I'm at the table with this work to do this.
So let me go back. You grew up in the Bronx.
Yes.
Okay, and you said that there was rubble.
Rubbles. Uh-huh.
And did your house burn? Is that what you said?
Yes. We had a row home on 178th Street and Park Avenue, and we know the histories. Decade of Fire talks about this in the documentary, even Dr. Mindy Philolove in her book Root Shop. You know, people started burning the Bronx for insurance claims. And
wait a minute. Hold on. The people you're talking about are the white land owners.
White landlords, and yes, that was the advent of it, and it spiraled into other directions, but most people don't know that history because they couldn't collect rents. So when you're caught in that crossfire of extractive economies, the resulting consequences, you have destroyed neighborhoods, and people who don't have the resources can't just leave. So it gives an experience that, again, says, what is going on here? How the hell does this happen in America? And that has influenced my trajectory in this work.
Okay. So I said earlier, you've taken on a lot. It's amazing to me of what you've taken on, because I've thought about everything you said, but not in a, how do I go about researching and writing down what's going on and then create policies and practices and get people to make change. Okay. So we have better housing, better education, better health care, better for us, and not an environment where we live in spaces. You know, we're talking about climate change, but Black folks and Native Americans have lived in spaces where water's bad, whether it's lead or ash or all these different kinds of things that causes the health to be bad. So I take my hat off to you. It's interesting what you're doing. Can you give us an example of, you have an example of a project that you're doing under practice of democracy?
Thank you, Ms. Jokes. I appreciate that feedback. And yes, one of the biggest projects that, I've always been in this space growing up in the Bronx, looking at co-op city or amalgamated housing, that always instilled upon me just like, wow, look at what we can accomplish when we put our minds to it, so to speak. Stable spaces with this ecology, not just a unit of housing, but the spaces around it form this ecology. I think that building off of that momentum and these experiences, it was hard to believe in 2022 that we, for me, facing barriers around access to capital and finance, particularly when buying a home in historically disinvested areas, becomes the impetus for one of our main initiatives and projects called This Land Project. And this land project is looking at, from soil to society, how do we redefine land practices from acquisition, tenure, and use? And for me, that includes invoking, if we access the land and can acquire it, particularly in neighborhoods like a Trenton, New Jersey, and beyond, where there's this hierarchy of human value of where we perceive that value to be. And it's shifting that psychology to say, well, if I buy land in these areas that, like the Bronx, no one wanted to be in, but look at the land value today, how can we do this now? Preserve it in a land trust or land bank model and develop it so that it's accessible in perpetuity particularly to the people who've been on the front lines of these conditions that want to stay in their communities, but because of what we have seen throughout time, the economics don't allow for that because of all the stuff that I think we're all very much familiar has had a knee on the neck of prosperity or equality. And we want to shift that, and we want to start with land.
So you mentioned land trust, community land trust. Can you tell folks what is that?
The community land trust, in the way we're practicing it, I mean, they've existed, in our conversations about the new communities space and the cooperative. And it was Slade King, Martin Luther King's cousin, who was part of founding that concept of this preservation of taking the land and protecting it and saying we're going to use this land to do lots of good things on it and not just extractive economies or making people perpetual renters or quote unquote sharecroppers. It's taking land, putting it in a trust that protects what happens on that land in perpetuity. And it's not just housing. It could be open space. We're more familiar with conservation trusts. But this model really looks at how do we resuscitate or take the baton from amalgamated and co-op city and develop things on land that will have a purpose that responds favorably to climate, to resiliency, to affordability, to equity. So a land trust takes land and preserves it in a trust for shared value uses indefinitely.
Okay. There is a black lady named Shirley Sherrard, and she and her husband, Charles, he passed a couple years ago. They went to Israel to learn about this land trust, and they created a new community land trust. Yeah, and she's just an awesome lady. She's been on the show. I went down to Albany and visited her, and I'm hoping to get down there before the end of the summer. Just an awesome lady, awesome lady. If you haven't met and talked to her, I think you two would enjoy talking to each other. Yeah, wonderful. So you've got this land project, and if you look at the Bronx, if you look at D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, all of these communities, the price have just shot up just tremendously. I came to D.C. in '86. You could buy a fourplex for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. Okay, now they're $500,000. Okay, easy, $500,000. So the value of land have gone up such that people's salaries have not gone up anywhere close to that. And the people's salaries in '86 too often could not afford to buy a fourplex or a house. They definitely can't afford today because their salaries have not gone up. So you see this land project is you're researching and design. So you research what's happening with land and building. That's correct, right?
That's correct.
And then you want to design some projects that will mitigate what you find. I say mitigate because we know you're going to find blighted areas or areas that, well, the average in the poverty level in the U.S. is $27,000 or below for a family of 4. I would suggest to you that that number is already too low.
Right.
Okay?
That's right.
Poverty level is probably $40,000 or $50,000 for a family of 4. But if you look at any of these areas, black, brown, and native folks are in these areas, but it turns out that there's as many white people as black and brown people in this area, and that people don't talk about that much. So you find out that people cannot afford housing.
Right. That's one metric. Absolutely. It's what's the affordability of it? Also, what's the condition of housing, right? We often just talk about affordability, but we don't look at what's already there in existing homeowners that live in dilapidated and inhumane conditions, and what are the resources being infused so that their windows function properly, their sewage systems are not backing up into their basements and in their homes. So it's a hybridity of social and spatial conditions that we research, and then we look at, well, what can we do about this? And, from my theory of change and doing this work for so many years is that first and foremost, we have to access the land. That house I was telling you about in the Bronx, for example, as a result of quote unquote low income housing coming in and, low LIHTC tax credits and new market tax credits coming in, that house that my mother suffered so much in, we suffered so much in, is now close to $1 million. There is no way I will ever be able to live in my community. And that house to me is not even $1 billion house. It's the value that has been appreciated over time, to your point, that has not. And why would we pay $1 million for it is the other question. So for us, it's not just looking at, reinforcing the brackets of affordability. It's looking at human need and saying, how do we work with the different spectrums of incomes, and not just this concept of low income. And as we speak more in the future, you'll know that's one of my pet peeve words, low income housing, because it just reinforces, again, this hierarchy of human value within the built environment. How do we build housing? How do we address existing housing stock? How do we build conscious consumerism through single family home ownership for people like me who can afford to pay? But we choose to live in areas that are still redlined from investments coming in. So you're competing with these REITs, these real estate investment trusts that come in, acquire all this property, develop them, shoot the prices up, and then we're all left holding emptiness in our hand. What's the counter to that? And that's what we're developing with this land project and incubating those who are not about maximizing profit, but understanding that there is an on-the-ground practice of housing equity, of commercial equity that needs to exist in order to nurture an environment or an ecosystem of community wealth and other assets within neighborhoods.
So is that where co-ops come in?
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly where co-ops come in. How we have incredible examples, and I mentioned them earlier, Amalgamated and Co-op City. They're maintained, they bring a value. How come we have not proliferated that in our development? You never use the word low income in any of those spaces, yet the income brackets of those would qualify for people who are considered low income. How come we have not built more limited equity cooperatives that give a sense of rootedness? And again, the experts are UHAB and others to tell you, and Ed Yanker from Amalgamated and others to tell you what this ecology looks like. But as rising costs all around these spaces happened in the rental market with no ownership, these areas have maintained affordability and accessibility while building forms of equity through your monthly payments. This is a brilliant model. And this is where it's one model that we could use once we have the land to develop it, because it's our choice, our consciousness to say, why aren't we doing this more? And that's what this land is to do.
So have you gotten an answer yet of why this model has not been used much more often?
I've gotten answers. Whether they satisfy my inquisition, that's another story. But I've gotten answers, and I think what really stands out for me is even with the market that's supposed to be addressing affordability, there's still a profit-driven model behind it. And, again, I don't have all the answers, but what I do know is that if it was done before, it can be done now, and putting together brilliant minds that know it can happen, and that we're not guided by extractive economies or maximizing as much profit. I think it's when we demonstrate that we're willing to do this, it becomes physicality, that I can walk down the street and say, like I did with Amalgamated or Quad City, look, not only is this housing a limited equity cooperative, but look, there's a cooperative supermarket or there's a cooperative coffee cafe that's right here in my own community. That's how people learn about these models. And we need the resources to make that happen and the brain power to make that happen. So if we believe in these models, there should be a plethora of them on our neighborhood block that connects the public to this type of work.
Okay, so to me, you're back to practice of democracy. Okay, because if you look at, let me go back a little bit further. I learned about co-ops because I started managing limited equity housing co-ops. I started a property management business here in Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of limited equity co-ops. And because they were smaller, the big management companies would not manage them. Too often, the smaller ones couldn't afford quality professional management. So I started managing them, and that's where I learned about co-ops. I did not learn about it in my formal education, not at all. I did not live in them. I did not know about it. I didn't have any co-op city in Bluefield, West Virginia. So I found that I really liked that everyday people, and these limited equity housing co-ops were mostly managed by middle-aged, older black ladies. And they made extremely good, if not great, decisions. And I was just amazed. They didn't have to go to a Stanford like I went to get an MBA. They got the training with the Principle 5, says, education, training, and information, the fifth principle of cooperation. And Marion Barry, the mayor, that black folks in D.C. like, they call him Mayor for Life, because he created TOPA laws, tenant laws that gave them the right to purchase. When a landlord put up a multifamily house, the tenants had the first right of refusal to purchase. And then they can come in and get funding to create these limited equity housing co-ops. Also, HUD had money for co-ops in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then they changed their money from going to limited equity housing co-ops to tax credits. And you mentioned LIHTC already. And if you look at and study tax credit to say, follow the money, who gets money of tax credits? It's the rich people and the large corporations will get tax credits, so they don't have to pay taxes. So the government lose that income, but they get more income by you putting up money for affordable housing. So affordable housing sounds good, but they don't keep it up. Okay, 10 years, 20 years out, roof have to be replaced, windows replaced. Sometimes they'll walk away. They just or sell it cheap or whatever, but they're in it for the maximum rate of return for their shareholders. Yeah. And you mentioned that already. That's what they're there for. So this practice of democracy is, from mine, it's the simple view. You got a much broader view, but mine is you vote for people that would get in and create policies that are best for the people that are voting. And so black folks, Hispanics, Native Americans should be voting for people that will tell HUD you put your money into limited equity housing co-ops, not in tax credits. Okay? Because the people in there, those black ladies that were managing it, these families that were $27,000 for a family of four or whatever, their lower income, they made decisions, and there was research done that said with the money they put in, they were getting 17% returns, even though it was limited equity. The returns were extremely high and much higher than they could have gotten anywhere else. Well, if they did rent, they don't get any return, zero. So all the way around, better housing, better place to live, to raise your children. It is a community of people. Watch out for each other, blah, blah, blah. And it's a better financial return. And HUD did not lose any money on these, co-ops. They got paid back. They lost more money, more foreclosures on these people that were capitalists. So, is this what you're looking to try to get people to vote for people that will put in the policies like with HUD, and we haven't hit healthcare or education yet, but just in housing, that will create the kind of housing stock that we need? And we only have a minute before break, so.
Absolutely. Everything, here to everything you've said, it's a yes and. It's not only just the power of voting and getting the people into office to pass the necessary policies. And we saw it with New York State passing the necessary resources that created Amalgamated. And that was at the turn of the 20th century. That was 1910 or a little after, where they created funding that says but you can't make profit off of it. It's to serve this purpose in perpetuity. And they succeeded in doing that. It's a yes and. And it's also mobilizing us on the ground and to say, what is the plurality that we can do absent any policy that changes the financial systems, that encourages others to do this work. So we'll continue this, and it's a great point to make.
Okay, we talked about the land project with April, and we'll be back and we'll talk about other projects that they have. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Co-op, and we have April De Simone on. I like your name, by the way, on today. April, we were talking about the land project under your practice of democracy, which you started. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about with the land project?
In addition to limited equity co-ops, which before the break we were talking about, it's also expanding our conscious consumer population or demographic. And we're also looking at single family homes because we often neglect that infusion of capital. And you have people living in conditions that are substandard, and they can't get the resources because we still have to combat the appraisal systems that say these areas aren't valuable until they are for someone else. And if we
wait a minute, I don't understand that. The appraisal systems have little value until they have value for someone else.
The appraisal systems say communities like the Bronx at one point, right? No longer, but Trenton, or where there's heavy blight, have no value because in order to fix, it'll cost more than what the property is worth. And what I mean by that is that we know these areas because they have the infrastructure of transportation, access to highways. It was the original city. In many cases, are extremely valuable because of their proximity to these resources or to these assets. But yet, because of who lives there, the face value is that we're not appraising these areas. And then what you end up getting is people who don't need to ask a bank or ask anyone for the resources, who have the investment pool, comes in, buys these areas up, infuses this investment, and we see everything start to go up alongside, the quote unquote affordable housing market. And this, to me, is a serious issue because the people there are valuable, regardless of what an appraisal system says. And it's been the game that has been played in the appraisal systems for far too long. And it's unfortunate that we haven't broken that code. And what we're hoping to do with this land project and the emerging developers and organizations that we're going to incubate under that project is to connect them to the narrative and the possibility and the financing that allows people to come in and says, first and foremost, it's not what we can see in the value of the land only over time, but people should not normalize that people live with raw sewage in their home, first and foremost. And we have to create mechanisms that addresses that. And to me, that is practicing these concepts of equity. So this is another component under this land project, is not just building limited cooperatives or working with those who want to develop these models, but it's also working with the existing homeowner. And typically it's elderly individuals who can't afford the maintenance or can't access the resources for the maintenance. We have to create a wider lens in addressing how we come in and, again, restitch neighborhoods that were intentionally disinvested in over time and allow the people who have been on the front lines of those conditions to stay.
Fascinating. The Downtown Crenshaw project, you know about it?
Yes.
The UCLA, I think it was UCLA, I don't think it was USC, UCLA's architecture, or it was one of their planning divisions put together a plan for Crenshaw that was just fascinating and taking into consideration the kinds of things that you're talking about. So there are people out there that are doing what you're talking about doing. It's up bringing them together, I guess, figuring out who all is doing it and getting more people in.
That's absolutely right. I'm very familiar with Damon and others at Downtown Crenshaw Rising and had the privilege of introducing them to an American Sustainable Business Network panel. And it's the type of model that we need to proliferate. And in order to proliferate these models, Mr. Oakes, we need the investments. I'm doing this land project so that we can create a plethora of similar projects like a Downtown Crenshaw Rising, because we have the talent in our communities, we have the brain power, and we need to lift those individuals up, not work in silos or just one-off projects. We need to make this commonplace. And when we can attract the resources to do that, we can create 1 million Downtown Crenshaw Risings, because the conditions that they're addressing, from inequitable land acquisition practices with the mall, and despite offering more, they couldn't get that, to what types of things are going to go on that land that they do acquire into their practice, and how do we design it and work with architecture firms and others who want to give back to the communities. We create this space through this land project that brings all of these people together so that we're lifting, again, a plethora of practitioners who are centered on advancing equity, healing, justice, and truth within the built environment.
Okay. You got a lot going on. So, People Studio Practicum, what is that?
The People's Studio Practicum is the space where we can incubate projects like this land project. It's a 501c3 that we launched as a public studio space so that people from all walks of life have a central location, like a public library meets a design firm, where they walk in from the street and learn everything that we're talking about through visualizations, through actual models, through other programming and events. It's very important to connect the public to this information. We know a lot of us cannot walk into the doors of think tanks that receive millions in funding and end up in white papers. We want to use that model, but we want to create it where the public can connect, where they can learn about this land project. Who are the individuals in this land project that are being incubated within this area? How do they get civically involved to advance the policies? We've had these public studio spaces in places like the Andrew Friedman home in the Bronx. We will be opening one up in Omaha, one in Trenton, that really, again, brings a nexus point to what you mentioned earlier. How do we cross-pollinate with each other? How do we learn best practices? How do we curate that it's not just one demographic we're addressing, but people who want to be activated to become stewards of this? What can they do through these learning in these spaces, what their addition is to the equation of social change? So that's what the People Studio practicum is. And it's how do we put our hands into the earth and begin getting them dirty and start playing with what we can change in our society. Because right now we don't have enough of those spaces.
All right. We don't have enough. And then the ones that we do have aren't together sharing best practices. And that's what you're about.
That's right. That's right. It's the only way to address what's happening in our world and in our society is collectivism.
You sound like a cooperator.
I'm learning from people like you and Michael Peck and Sarah Horowitz, who are incredible. Mutualism, all of this is what we need to make mainstream, not some outlier that people look at with a side eye. It's saying, how do we normalize that this is how we should practice both, a business? How should we do this? It's shared value.
So Michael Pex and Sarah Horowitz have been on the show, and anybody out there would like to go and listen to our previous shows. We have almost 400 shows on our webpage, which is www.everything.coop. So you can go to everything.coop, and you can put Michael Peck in or Sarah Horowitz, and in a couple of weeks, you could put in April De Simone, and you could listening to this show. Okay. What do you do for raising money?
I love, yeah.
You said access to capital. Go ahead, tell me.
It's capital comes in different forms, and right now, as of June 27th, Mr. Oates, we have launched our crowdfunding campaign. We have been speaking with various philanthropic organizations so that we can acquire the resources. And I think the important point in what we're saying here is that I didn't have the capital to do everything that I've shared so far on the show. I work through my fee for service, and I use that money to put towards this land project or the People Studio practicum because I believe in these spaces, and because I believe in the power of people and what we can do collectively. And right now, this is where we are at, and we hope that we can inspire individuals just like people were inspired by Downtown Crenshaw Rising to put resources forward to incubate many Downtown Crenshaw Risings, as I said before, to really advance this work so that it's mainstream and not some outlier thing over there that's happening that we can create a case study, but that I can walk down the street and see here's a cooperative business in a space that they're not going to worry about whether they'll be priced out through rents, but that it's part of a land trust model that preserves their presence, that plays a crucial role in the entrepreneurial and commercial space, some communities, and the same for housing.
So, April, we've been on air. At least this October, we would celebrate our 11th year on air. National Cooperative Bank has been our main financial sponsor in those 11 years. Have you had an opportunity to work with them at all, or even ask them for grant money to help you with this project?
I've been very blessed through a coalition assembled by Michael Peck to be introduced to an individual by the name of John from Rochdale Capital.
John Holtzclaw. John Holtzclaw from Rochdale. Okay.
Yes, John Holtzclaw, right, who started Rochdale Capital. And I think that that's the next phase of this connection. And this is the power, right, of what we're speaking of, that people are coming together in a room and sharing and leveraging networks and resources. The short answer is no, I have not directly spoken to the National Cooperative Bank, but through these individuals, that's hopefully the next step in this work to acquire the resources to do this. Because again, in 2024, something needs to shift because this hamster wheel is getting tiring of just going around and around and around.
Well, NCB's mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. And they were formed in the 80s to do this, help co-ops and their members in low-income communities. And this is what we have been talking about. And Rochdale Capital was born in NCB, and Chuck Snyder's the past president. He and Holtzclaw started Rochdale Capital And then they also have Capital Impact Partners, which is another group to potentially get funding. And I mentioned Hugh Jeffers to you. He's worked with the National Association of Housing Co-ops, and he does, his main job, though, is funding projects. So there's a lot of spaces. But tell me, if I wanted to put some money in your crowdfunding, how would I go about doing that, or anybody that's listening?
You would visit www.peoples, with an S, -studio.org. When you get to the page, you go to projects, and you'll see this land project, and the donate button is there.
Okay, are you looking for people that can donate $100,000 or $100?
That'd be nice. That would be fantastic. We're looking for all donations, big and small, program-related investments, mission-related investments. As a 501c3, the goal is to then deploy this into the different programs and partners we're incubating under this land project. So anything is, it is great, and it meets the hope of the people that I come across, that serves as my sustenance. As I shared with you, meeting elders yesterday at Tuskegee University, or the Tuskegee area of Alabama, who were part of the SNCC movement. There's this hope that we possess that gives us this consciousness of a duty, of what we're supposed to steward forward. And it would be nice if that hope can meet the people within the space of finance and resources to say, I believe in that hope as well. And I can see that what you're doing on the ground with others really can shape our humanity. And that's what I want to invest in.
Okay. So we're having an election coming up, a presidential election coming up. How does this group get involved with the election in terms of getting people out to vote, or putting the issues before the candidates, or how do you participate in the elections?
So one trajectory we're using in our first demonstration project in Trenton, New Jersey, which is a single family home that we've acquired, and we're in the process of raising funding to restore it as the first project in the land trust. We do things called house talks, where not only is it just encouraging people to come out to vote, but it's understanding the conditions of the why for their vote and bringing that proximity. You spoke of the elderly Black women who manage the limited equity co-ops in DC. Proximity becomes a game changer when people can immerse themselves in the conditions of the why. And through these house talks, we just had one on June 27th called the New Deal. And essentially, we take people in, we have different speakers come in to ground people in this understanding of how we have gotten to the conditions we've gotten here and what are they doing about it. We had, for example, on the 27th, the Kensington Corridor Trust in North Philly, who's doing phenomenal work around land trusts. We had John Comer from the Redress Movement. So we congregate people in intimate spaces like a couch talk in a home, and then we go out and tour the neighborhood. So that's our civic participation in explaining the why, not just go and vote, but why you're voting and who you're voting for. And regardless of what happens in these elections, particularly in November, the work still has to continue. So where are the spaces you can come back to that are going to do the work regardless of the results in November?
Okay. So I went to your webpage, and I was pleased to find out. I went to www.peoples, and with an S, plural, // studio.org. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was first pleased to see that the donate button was on the first page. You didn't have to go to projects to donate. So I was pleased to see that. Now I'm trying to work through to figure out, and you got $1, $5, $10, $100. So you don't have a space for $1,000. So I guess you don't want that, I guess.
No, I want that. I'll have to go back and check, but thank you for bringing that to my attention. We're raising our resources through IOBE.org, which stands for In Our Backyards. I can, let me just double check while we're on.
Oh, it has a space for other. I'm joking.
Okay.
It has a space for other. I am so excited about what you're doing that I really want to make sure that people out there know how they can support financially, because financially, getting the capital more often than not is what keeps us from getting things done. Okay. Any other projects that you're working on besides the single-family home in Trenton?
Yes, it's exciting. As I said, we're not just about, this land project just serves as an incubator. So not only are we working with Betsy, who's joining it's a community development corporation that focuses on shared equity and shared land models, but we're also working with Sababu Capital, who is an emerging Black developer. And I think there's been enough coverage on the barriers Black and brown developers face within doing the work within their own communities. And it's wonderful because it's being able to teach the value of either the cooperative movement or shared value or shared equity or mutualism, whatever you want to call it. But we're working with him to develop one of his parcels into a hybrid hospitality housing development or structure. And we've connected resources from pro bono architectural services to preliminary conversations of how that could be financed. And again, this is what I'm talking about, where we cross-pollinate the resources so that it's not just one model, one person that gets them. It's really fanning this out to say how we can support that, particularly people who otherwise would not have the entry point into these spaces. This is the critical piece of the work. So we're super excited about that. I don't know if many of you know Eaton Workshop in DC.
What's the name of it?
Eaton Workshop, DC. I think it's on K and 11th or K and 10th Street. It's such a brilliant model. And, Sheldon Scott, who's a close friend and colleague, I was just always impressed watching that hotel go up. So they're a hospitality brand, but it is a center of a cultural hub where we want to incorporate that idea into other spaces across the United States where you have a hotel, but you have housing. And that's a growing model in one unit. And how does that housing, whether it's limited equity housing or cooperatives or whatever, how do you create that space? And connecting with developers and saying there's this avenue here to do that is really exciting. So that's another project we're working on.
Oh, I like the name. I like that project. I want to go see that.
I'm excited to invite you to Trenton to come and see all of the stuff we're doing there.
Okay. What do you see the future for this work?
It's such a pivotal question for me. Despite the complexities of America, and, I'm an American, and I'm very patriotic to these value systems. And we're coming upon our semi-quincentennial of the 250th anniversary of, founding of American democracy. And I believe that it's iterative. And the future for me is how more of us activated in the things we've talked about on your show to go out and demand and steward it, not just through marching, which is certainly critical and important, but how do we navigate the resources to manifest all the things that came before us and make them again commonplace? Because what will the next 250 years look like? What type of legacy do we want to leave behind? This is my work, and this is what I'm passionate about, and I want to infect others with that passion, to see the value and not give up, because too many have given up, to say democracy or equity or America swirling down the toilet. It's up to us to change that from both a political space, but I think what changes politics or on a political level is what happens on the ground. And if we can activate the ground, the block, our neighborhoods, really heal one another from what has happened, these legacies of dehumanization, I think we have a different trajectory. And that's me, the future I want to be a part of, and the work I want to be a part of, and encourage others to be a part of.
How can people donate to your work?
Again, visit www.peoples-studio.org. And your donation, you'll see how your work, how your donations, and it's not even just monetary, Mr. Oakes. I think people who, like when we started our conversation here, connect with this person, connect with that person. You leverage your relationships and your network. Michael Peck is impeccable in that space, in always lifting someone else up. I think that that's what we need more of. So it's not just, if you can't give the $100 or, I heard, I think downtown Kentrell's story that, people were pulling it out of their, the grandmas are pulling $100 out. It's important for people to understand that they can contribute, and it, not just $1, but also through hope and leveraging networks and be intentional with that. Too much where we give rhetorical nods and gestures to this work, but the follow-up, because it's really hard to do, why not support the people who are willing to take on the lift and do that in a multiplicity of ways? Be intentional. Show up for something different.
Okay. So the intentionality of it all, for me, has been get out and vote. Okay. Find out who you want to vote for. Do you want to vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? And look at what their policies are, what they stand behind in terms of housing, health care, education, child care, all the different kinds of things that you've talked about. What do they stand for? And then support them by making telephone calls or giving money or going to rallies and getting people or getting everybody in your family to go vote. Now, you bring a whole nother interesting level to this in this practice of democracy. Yeah. This intentionality of saying, here is a project that I'm going to support. This is a group of people I'm going to support. And if you have $1, you give $1. If you don't have $1, you give some time. Time, talent, treasure. That's what I learned in church.
Amen. And you get an amen for that.
So,
absolutely.
What message would you like to leave people with?
That humanity is worth fighting for. And if we can raise hundreds of millions of dollars for an election, we should raise hundreds of millions of dollars to apply those same values of the things we want to vote someone into office to do, to give ourselves the agency, again, at the scale of a neighborhood block, to do it ourselves as well. Invest in people. And I have a strong feeling when you invest on that block, it's going to change how we invest in the vote and what happens on the voting and the policy level. And let's do that. Let's collectively scale our humanity.
Humanity is extremely important, yes. And we've got a lot that we can work on. And we mentioned the environment and climate change, but yeah, that's the biggie that's going on right now.
That's right.
www.peoples-studio.org. Please go to their website. And everybody out there, we'll see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything Co-op.